Some people think that in ethics all we have is our judgments, our feelings perhaps about right and wrong, but we have no way of arriving at a rational method of resolving our differences. And I want to dispute that and illustrate a method of moral reasoning, first proposed by the philosopher John Rawls, which shows us how we can proceed in a rational manner. Should there be a market for kidneys? And let's make it more precise. At the moment in Britain, you're allowed to donate your kidneys to someone you love or even to a total stranger, but you're not allowed to receive payment for it. And many people think this is not merely morally permissible, but in fact an excellent thing if you do so. On the other hand, it's prohibited, and many people think it would be morally wrong to have a market for kidneys where you would be allowed to sell your kidney to either a private buyer who needs it, or perhaps the state, the NHS, could buy kidneys and distribute them on the basis of need. I'm especially interested in this second type of case, the case in which the National Health Service would pay people for their kidneys and give it to people who would otherwise die for lack of a kidney. If you consider that case, many people, and myself included, would have a sense that there's something wrong about it. I'd be very, very cautious before, say, voting in favor of it. That sense of there being something wrong is what Rawls called a case judgment. Just as we have a case judgment that it's perfectly all right, in fact laudable, for people to give away their kidneys. But where moral reasoning comes in is the question, why do we have these case judgments? And especially about the difference between the two. Why would it be permissible to give away your kidney, but not permissible to sell it? Rawls says we can take an analogy here with what we might be doing in science. Suppose you're a social scientist and you have two data points. So what you're looking for is a general theory which fits this data, if you can fit the data, and which also offers a good explanation of those two data points and perhaps many other data points. And your relationship between the theory and data would be kind of going back and forth. You might find a data point which you would call an outlier, which you couldn't explain with any theory. Then you might conclude not that the theory is wrong, but that the data is faulty. Now, what's the analogy here with moral reasoning? We have our two data points, right? The data points being our judgment, it's okay to give away your kidney, it's not okay to sell it. And what we'd be looking for is general theoretical principles, moral principles that would fit this data, if possible, and explain it or justify it. This method is what Rawls called the method of reflective equilibrium. We start with case judgments, we look for theoretical principles that are consistent with and explain these case judgments, but if we really can't find them, and we have some attractive theoretical principles, we might end up revising our case judgments. And so we keep going on back and forth between case judgments and theory, right, in order to find a coherent whole. So let's go through this process in the case of our judgments about kidney markets. So one thing you might say is, let's consider a general principle of promoting people's well-being. We want people to be better off. Could this account for our moral unease about someone selling their kidney? Well, it's not clear that it could. So this principle would say that we should permit people to sell their kidneys if it would make people better off. Well, on the recipient end, the person who would get the transplant kidney, absolutely someone would be much better off. Right? On the seller's end, there might be some more doubts. Right? We might think, well, what's the risk of selling your kidney? Wouldn't you be worse off in terms of health afterwards? Well, there the answer is, if it's done in a state-of-the-art hospital, the risk is in fact quite low, as low as in some risky professions which we do permit, like being a deep-sea diver for a complex engineering project or something like that. So if we merely appeal to well-being, or as some philosophers would call it, good consequences, consequentialists, we simply look at the outcomes of permitting it, then so long as we can check whether the people are being rational when they're making the decision to sell their kidney, we would expect it to be good all round. So if we left it there, then we would be in reflective disequilibrium, as Rawls would put it, right? We have a case judgment, there's something morally off about selling your kidney, but we can't explain it by an appeal to a principle involving well-being or good consequences. Well, what about a different type of principle, a rights-based principle? So many philosophers have argued that we have rights over our bodies. This gives us a sense of control and respects our dignity. Could we here appeal to a rights-based principle to explain this judgment? Well, again, it looks difficult. So long as you think, as for example Aaron and Harris propose in their idea of people selling their kidneys to the NHS, that there would be careful testing of people's knowledge about what they're getting into, about their ability to make a decision well, then they would seem to have every right to do with their body what they want, right? You can smoke, you can drink, you can go on a risky skiing trip or mountain climbing. Why not engage in similar or even lower risks for the sake of the money that you would get from selling a kidney and perhaps the good that you're doing? So again, if we appeal to a rights-based principle, we cannot explain our moral unease. But if we take this method seriously, we try even harder to see if there isn't something that we're missing. So a further set of moral ideals involves what we might call egalitarian relationships. And what this means is the idea that each one of us, though we're different in many ways, has the status of an equal citizen. That means that you and I can encounter each other in public, and I'm not superior to you. I can't dominate you. I shouldn't be able to exploit your weaknesses, and I ought to treat you with a certain respect as a fellow citizen. Now, could we appeal to this general idea about egalitarian relationships to explain our judgment? Well, maybe. Typically, when one considers a society in which some sell their kidneys to the National Health Service, for example, you think, oh, it's going to be the poor who are selling their kidneys, right? And this may color our sense of those who are financially less well off as merely a resource to be exploited for the sake of other people. Now, this idea is a bit vague. You might say, well, there's things we could do to prevent this being a disrespectful or exploitative relationship. But nonetheless, it is true that our standing as equals in society is determined a lot by how others perceive us. And being perceived as merely a useful resource for others, right? And perhaps coming to perceive oneself in that way can be very damaging, right? Damaging to this egalitarian relationship in a society in which people could sell their organs. One thing would be that some, the less well off, would come under pressure to monetize their bodies in new ways. So suppose you had a student loan which was due, and you might be declared bankrupt, but wait a moment, you have a resource, right? Your kidney might be worth several tens of thousands of pounds. Couldn't you be required, right, to give up this resource the same way you would be required to sell a car or a house that you owned to pay off the loan? you might say, look, there's going to be new opportunities for domination, for pressure, for exploitation in a way that is moreover humiliating or marginalizing of groups who are already less well off than others. And that idea, that relational egalitarian idea, might provide grounds for our initial sense that there's something off. I haven't given you an outright argument that we have to ban kidney sales, but I've suggested that a third principle, relational egalitarianism, might actually explain our judgment, but notice that it depends on some empirical judgments, which may prove true or false, and that's where we might need some social science, right? Would it really be the case that people would come under this particular form of pressure? Would it really be the case that people would regard this as an assault on their dignity or perceive themselves and be perceived as second-class citizens?